invited speaker series. I'm Jo Sanders, and today we have an art historian. I am happy to introduce Keely Heuer. Is that how to pronounce? That's right. Okay. She is assistant professor of art history at SUNY New Paltz, and she specializes in the visual culture of the ancient Mediterranean, particularly Greece and Rome. She received her PhD from NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. Keely leads unique summer study abroad programs focused on archaeological sites and museums in Italy and in Greece. She has published many articles about her research on the iconography of Greek vase painting and the interrelations between Greek settlers and indigenous populations of pre-Roman Italy. Keely is going to be talking today, as you can probably see on the screen, childhood in ancient Greece, from cradle to citizenship. Keely, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really warm introduction, and it's such a treat for me to be here today. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right, good. If I need to, I'll get my professor voice on and really blast you away, but I don't want to shake you out of your seats here. I'd like to preface by saying, if you are interested in this material, if you're interested in the ancient Mediterranean world, I do invite you to come and audit any of my classes at any time. That is an open invitation, and I'm very happy to give you my card, and we can stay in touch, and I'd love to have you join us at any time. This semester, I'm teaching the art of ancient Egypt, so if you want to be transported away to a warm, sunny, sandy place, which is sounding really good right now, especially since I was just there less than a week ago, and I'm going, why am I not in Cairo still? What am I doing here? I should be on a camel somewhere. So if I'm a little fuzzy, I apologize, because I'm still trying to get on the right time zone, and we just started teaching, and bless my poor students, I showed up and I said, all you're getting is a syllabus today. All right, I'm not promising anything else at this point. But this is a topic that I'm very interested in. I'm very interested in women in particular in the ancient world, because there are 51% of the population and 0% of the ancient voices that have come down to us, with the exception of Sappho and a few fragments from other female authors. And so I'm really interested in looking at the visual evidence we have about their lives and their experiences. And I've also been teaching classes on things like ancient food and ancient textiles recently, to again kind of embody their experience and how they would have spent their lives. So a lot of my presentation today is going to focus on women's lives and what their experiences were growing up, and how they differed significantly from that of boys and young men. So to start today, I do want to note that children in antiquity, there was a very different conception of childhood than what we have today, and very little sense of adolescence, of like what we think of. You're a child and then you're adult. You jump from one to the other. And there was certainly treatment of children in the past that by our standards we would certainly call abusive. However, there is also plenty of evidence for a very positive attitude and treatment of children in classical antiquity. And we know that the ancient Greeks greatly valued children as a vehicle for not only perpetuating their family line, but they also frowned upon people who were celibate and were childless. They thought them as being useless to society. If you weren't cranking out kids, why do we have you around? And in fact, in ancient Rome, you paid taxes if you were a bachelor, because it's like, settle down, get married, have a family. That's your duty in life. But we also know that they established a social system that provided for the welfare of orphans. Children were frequently adopted, so if a family, as we'll touch on, there was really no reliable birth control in the ancient world, and so sometimes people's families became larger than what they could afford. And there were a couple solutions to this. Very common solution was you would actually abandon the child. You would leave it out, you wrap it up nice and snug and warm somewhere, and you hope that somebody else finds it. And people did this a lot. They took in children, either that they didn't have children of their own, or they had the means to support other children. So this is a quite common theme, and especially mythology. You have lots of abandoned babies that end up growing up to be heroes and heroines of various types. So I'd like to start today by kind of starting at the beginning, starting with infants. We're going to work our way chronologically. This is a really unusual sculpture. This was found in a cemetery in a location called Megara Hypolea, which is a Greek settlement, a Greek colony in Sicily, of which there were many of these in southern Italy and Sicily. It's basically life-size, a little less than life-size. It's limestone, and stone sculpture is quite rare in Sicily, full stop. So just that alone is unique, but the fact it was found in a cemetery is also very curious. And we think that probably it was intended to mark a grave, probably that of a woman, maybe a woman who may have died in childbirth or was a mother and wanted to be commemorated as such. But why it's also very unique is the fact that she is being shown actually nursing her children. Breastfeeding images are extraordinarily rare in Greek and Roman art. And even rarer are images of pregnant women, even though we know women were pregnant a lot of their lives. And we don't know exactly why there was this maybe discomfort with showing that kind of imagery. Perhaps in the sense of, in the case of pregnancy, it was a fear of that it was such a risky thing that you don't want to show something before its completion. Maybe you'll jinx it somehow, and so it's better just to show a mother with a child. That's safer than a mother who's expecting a child. And we have lots of images of mothers holding babies, cradling them in their arms, but actually nursing them is unusual. And here she has twins. She's nursing two at once. And this has led to the interpretation that this might not be just any ordinary mother, but this might be a goddess. And in particular, since she was found in a funerary context, this might be the goddess Nyx, the goddess of night. And she has two famous twin sons, Hypnos, which means sleep, and Thanatos, who is death. So maybe this is the explanation for this unusual grave marker. We also, speaking about death and children and babies, we do know that infanticide was a rather common practice in ancient Greece. And this was typically done when it was felt that the child was too sickly to survive, which was frequent, or for economic necessity. If you could not afford to feed that child, raise that child, give that daughter a dowry, for example. Daughters were very expensive to have through much of human history. That's why you have Pride and Prejudice and Mrs. Bennet weeping and wailing about how she has 5 unmarried daughters and how are they going to finance all of this. We know, in fact, that in Sparta, the law required that all infants that seemed to have any sort of physical abnormalities had to be exposed by law. Society was not going to raise them. And so instead what they would do is they wouldn't actually kill the baby because that would be murder. Instead, you would just abandon the baby, you leave it out in nature, and it's like, well, if the gods will that it's going to live, it will be fine. Someone will pick up the baby, something will happen, something miraculous will happen. And if it doesn't, I'm not guilty of committing a crime. So as I mentioned, infant mortality was incredibly high in ancient Greece. It's difficult to figure out statistics because we do, of course, have many cemeteries, many burials with children, but because their bones are so delicate, they tend not to survive well in the archaeological records. We don't have a really good sense of how many babies did not necessarily make it through their first few years of life, but the estimate is that about 1 in 3 children survived infancy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's shockingly high. And then life expectancy for men was around 45. And interestingly, converse to what it is nowadays, where women typically live longer than men, women only lived to about 36 years of age. Why do you think that might be? We're gonna make this bingo, childbirth. Yes, that was the riskiest of things for women, not only because of complications in labor, because they couldn't do things like C-sections easily without essentially killing the mother in the process, but usually it was because of infection. No one realized it's a good idea that you should wash your hands before you deliver a baby, for example. And this led to problems a few days after a woman gave birth. So expectant mothers would often pray to 2 goddesses in particular. One was Artemis, who's the protector of young women and girls. And women were not seen as being fully adult until they gave birth to their first child. Then you were an adult. It wasn't just marriage that kind of was the threshold to this change in your life. And there was another goddess called Eleathea, who's the goddess of actual labor and delivery, who would assist you through that process. Now this is a grave marker, a tombstone from Athens. And at the top there's an inscription that gives us some information about who this person is. Her name is Amphitrite, and she is cradling an infant in her arms. And had it not been for the inscription, we probably would have assumed this is a mother and child, and the mother probably died in childbirth. That's the standard kind of imagery for those circumstances. But the inscription gives us some really interesting information. The inscription is written as though the deceased is speaking to the viewer, and it says, "I hold this, my daughter's dear child, whom I held on my lap when we were alive and looked at the rays of the sun with our eyes, and now being dead, I hold it dead." So possibly this woman and her grandchild were actually buried together, and they are commemorated together on this grave marker. And in this instance, obviously it's not a situation where a woman died in childbirth. Probably there was some type of infectious disease that swept through the household, and that's why the very young and the very elderly are often the first to fall victim to these types of things. And so that might explain why the 2 of them died around the same time. But this monument also provides us with invaluable evidence for the role of grandmothers in child rearing, that they were very much involved in helping probably their daughters typically in raising children, and also the strong bonds that went across generations. So I do want this to be a bit interactive today and not all just lecture-y here. So we're gonna have a few little slides here. I'm gonna ask you to try to guess what some things are, to see if you put your thinking cap on. I do this to my students as well. I torture them all the time. What do you think this is? What do you think?
Well, it would be a great high chair, but the hole leads me to think it's a potty corner.
Bingo, that's exactly what it is. Some things never change. It is in fact a potty chair, yes. This was found in the Agora, the main marketplace of Athens, and this was discovered when one of my professors was in charge of this excavation. So there's this absolutely priceless photograph of his daughter being stuck in it, and she is howling. And she's like, "I'll never live this down, Dad. I can't believe you did this." Everyone knows it's Meredith in the potty chair. But this other image is the interior of a cup, also produced in Athens, that shows one of these things in use. And like anyone with toddlers today, anything that you can do to keep them in one place at a certain point is very effective. They did not have diapers back in the day, and so probably potty training started pretty early in the game, and that's why children just would wear little sheaths, because the minute they looked like they were about to go, boy, you just thump them on top of the potty chair and let them do their business, and hopefully train them very, very quickly to learn how to use a chamber pot, essentially, or a latrine. as I got a little bit older. But yes, I love this image of this baby reaching out to mama, legs kicking. You can just imagine the squalling, you know, to pick me up, as all babies want to be picked up and carried around, and it's like, nope, mama needs a break here. Yes,
What kind of cup would be appropriate for that kind of scene?
I have no idea. You know, in some ways I kind of wonder if this is like a joke sort of cup, where it's like, you know, a new father, because mainly it's men who were drinking wine at you know, these symposia, these drinking parties, and I think as a joke, it's like, congratulations on your new baby. This is what your life's gonna be like. Poo and screaming for quite a while. Get ready. So on the 5th day after baby was born, the father would decide whether or not to keep the baby, to officially recognize it and welcome it into the family. And this was done by bringing the baby into the kitchen, the hearth, and you would hold the baby and run around the hearth. That was the tradition. And the hearth was thought as the most sacred heart of the home, if you will. And that was the official recognition that, you know, the father is going, yes, this is mine. You know, this can be my heir, things like that. And in ancient Greece, you always had the baby shower after the baby was born, on the 10th day after birth. And this is when the baby would be given a name. And Aristotle tells us that the delay for doing this was because the majority of infant deaths took place in the first week. So you want to make sure it made it to that first week before you got too attached to that baby and you gave it a name, because it would make it all the more painful to have to say goodbye. And on the 10th day, family and friends would bring presents, and it would be a big celebration in the home. And just like today, when people have babies, you know, they might put a sign out in the yard, it's a boy, it's a girl, or balloons, or things like that. They actually did something similar in ancient Greece as well. So if you had a little girl, what you would hang outside your door was a tuft of wool, because she was going to spend the rest of her life making textiles and spinning and weaving wool. That was her destiny. You had a little higher aspirations for your son, you would put an olive wreath outside your door, because that's what was given to Olympic victors. So you're gonna hope your kid's gonna win the Olympic Games someday. Now here's another object. Let's see if you can figure out what it was used for. Again, we have things very similar to this today. Maybe not as cute. Any guesses?
A cup? A sippy cup?
It's a sippy cup. It's a bottle. See the little nipple at the tail there? That's exactly what it's used for. So this is one in the shape of a rat. Maybe not the most ideal thing to give to a child, but anyways, we would have seen a lot probably. They have done trace analysis studies on these containers to try to determine like what was inside them. And as you might expect, they found milk, but sometimes they find a little something else instead. Honey, also wine.
Of course.
So if you have a colicky baby, just knock it out for the night. It's very effective. And actually on top of this feeder where you see the larger opening, there is a little strainer. So it seems as they would kind of like mash things in there. So they might have even made sort of like an equivalent. We have like rice cereal today that we might mix with milk, but just to kind of grind it up and make it finer so that the baby could easily drink it without choking it all on it. We also have many depictions of elderly women caring for children, and these are nursemaids. So if you were a well-to-do family, as a lady of the household, the odds are very good that you probably would not nurse your own baby, that you have a wet nurse, and that you'd have essentially a nanny that would take care of that child. And one of the reasons for this is that as you're nursing, you're less likely to become pregnant. And so if you want to have a big family, you do not want your wife nursing for a couple of years. You want her to stop nursing, and so you have a wet nurse take care of this instead. And I love this little terracotta figurine. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where you see this woman sort of stooped over, and she's clearly struggling with this kind of squirmy baby, and we've all dealt with little children, probably that do that spaghetti mode where they just go boneless and trying to hold on to this little critter. We know that there are very affectionate bonds between these nursemaids and the children that they help to raise. And we have a number of really touching tombstones that were clearly dedicated by the child who had been raised by this woman. And so this is an example of one from the British Museum, and the inscription says, "Here the earth covers the worthy nurse of Hippostrade, so now she misses you. While you were alive, I loved you, nurse, and now I honor you still, even though you lie beneath the soil, and I shall honor you as long as I live. And I know that even beneath the soil, if there is really any reward for the worthy, you above all, nurse, have honors lying in store with Persephone and Pluto." Now, we should be under no illusions that these women who served as nurses were most likely not paid servants. These are all enslaved peoples. And the majority of these enslaved women came from what is now northern Greece and southern Bulgaria, a region that was called Thrace in antiquity. And the Thracians had a practice of tattooing. And typically their nobles would tattoo themselves. It was a sign of high rank. However, in the Greek world, tattooing was a sign of slavery, that you would mark your slaves. And so they saw being tattooed as a horrible thing. But we see depictions of these Thracian women, and this is actually a mourning scene, somehow on here. So we have the Thracian woman, and you can see these lines on her face. These are tattoos. And she's cradling the head of this young woman, probably in her late teens. This is probably the girl that she raised. And so she is the one that is closest to her, not her mother necessarily. And another clue that she is not Greek and also an enslaved person is the fact that her hair is cut short and it's a lighter color than the other women. The Thracians were known for having red hair and blonde hair, which was quite unique for the Greeks. And so that was another thing that they saw sort of physically differentiating themselves from the Thracians. So just like children today, kids in ancient Greece had lots of toys and loved to play all different kinds of games. And we find toys typically in child burials, or there are sanctuaries. For example, the sanctuary of Artemis at Brauron, which is about 20 miles away from Athens, that children, particularly girls on the cusp of becoming adults, would often dedicate their toys to Artemis. And so we have dolls and dice and little figurines of animals and people and pole toys and pretty much anything that you might find in a toy store today, there was an ancient equivalent thereof. And so kids have been kids forever. And some of the games that they like to play, we read about in literary sources. We also have visual depictions of them. This is a game called Ephedrismos, and we recognize it instantly by the very strange pose that these two girls are in. And Ephedrismos consisted of putting a larger stone on the ground, and it was kind of like bocce. Every person would roll a stone, and the person who kind of was furthest away from it was it, essentially. So the person who was it had to carry somebody else on their back in this funny sort of way with your knee up. And typically the person on the back would take their hands and cover that person's eyes, and they had to stumble around until they could find the big stone with their foot again. And then they were released from their duty and you'd start all over again. So it was kind of a strange like mix of bocce and freeze tag in a way, I guess you might say. And we also have lots of evidence of children, particularly girls playing with dolls, and we have these wonderful jointed dolls that kind of remind me a little bit of like my first Barbie, so it's easy to take the clothes on and off because they're jointed and they move. We actually have an example of a woman holding one of these on a gravestone, and so they seem to have been suspended. They may have even been used like puppets or marionettes and would kind of dance and move around. And there's some suspicion they may have also been used in ritual practices as well. Of course, we also, actually, let's see, this is another kind of guess. I don't know if you can see what these women are doing. They're older and they're staring. They have sticks in their hands, like right here, and they're looking at these kind of funny, sort of triangular objects on the ground. We still have toys like this today, maybe a little old-fashioned by modern child standards, but I certainly played with these. Kind of like jacks? Tops, that's right. So there would be a string attached to the stick, and you wrap the string on the top, and you kind of like crack the whip, and that's what gets the top to spin. So that was a very common game as well. We have, they play with knuckle bones. So they would use knuckle bones of goats and sheep. Like we use dice today because each side of the knuckle bone is shaped differently. So you would roll the knuckle bones and play games kind of like jacks or rolling dice. And people would gamble on this all the time. So these are some young ladies who are throwing knuckle bones. We also see like hoop and stick games that are very common as well. We also have lots of ball games of various kinds, but they aren't team sports like we have baseball or basketball or soccer or things like that. They did function that way in ancient Greece. They're usually played with a very small group of people. And playing with a ball has a sort of flirtatious connotation to it. And we often see the god Eros, the god of love, is often holding a ball in his hand. But this game, these two boys are playing, is a game that in modern terms we call it passe-boule, which is a French term. But the gist of it was kind of like ancient basketball or ancient soccer, because you would put a board in the ground upright and there'd be a hole cut through it. And the idea is you were trying to throw the ball through the hole and the other person is trying to block it. So again, kind of like guarding the goal or guarding the basket, except it's on the ground and not up in the air. I also love these depictions of children with pull toys. I think these are just an absolute riot. They remind me of those old Fisher-Price ones that had little poppers on them. I love that when I was a kid. That was a favorite of mine. And you might notice that a lot of these vases I'm showing you of children playing with toys are the same shape. They're quite small. They're a couple inches in height. And the shape of it is called a coos. And it is a jug or a little juglet. And every February, about mid-February, there was a festival in Athens called the Anthesteria. And this was the tasting of the new wine, the new vintage. So you had crushed the grapes in the fall, you let the juice ferment over the winter, and now you're gonna taste it and see how things are turning out. And this was typically a springtime festival. This is when you were gonna start, harvesting crops pretty soon. Greece is much warmer than New York, obviously. But during the Anthesteria, this was the time that little boys, usually about age 3, were given their first official taste of wine. So it's kind of a little sort of coming of age ritual. And at the Anthesteria, all the male participants in this event would be given a koos. That was a standard unit of measure. It's about 2.5 liters of wine. And they would sit and drink it all at once. Can you imagine? And the first person to finish without losing their cookies got a prize. Except you were drinking in silence. We're not allowed to talk. Everyone just chugged it down, I suppose. But the little boys got their own little mini version of the same shape, the same vase, obviously not 2.5 liters for a 3-year-old, But this was kind of marking their entry into the world of men, that they were allowed to drink socially. So I imagine a lot of proud papas carrying their little toddler boys to these events and giving them this gift. And so that's why we see a lot of little boys, little children playing on them. They're clearly toddlers by their kind of tubby proportions. They're often crawling on all fours in these scenes. And many of these vases have been found in burials. And we think that if a child did not make it to the age that they got to enjoy this during their lifetime, the parents would bury them with one of these little vases. So something that they could take with them to the hereafter. So they kind of fulfill the things, the milestones that they would have enjoyed in their lifetime. All right, so what else do I want to mention here? We also have lots of representations of children with pets. So again, lots of things don't change. We see children with all sorts of creatures, dogs, not really cats. Cats were not a big thing in ancient Greece. They existed, they were extraordinarily expensive. They were being imported from Egypt. It was a very big deal to get a cat. But we also see children with things like rabbits, birds are very, very common. So this little girl over here, she has a rabbit kind of cradled in the drapery across her body. Here you have a young girl with her little dog, a little Spitz dog. You have two main types of dogs in Greece. Cute little fluffy ones like this for your house, which were probably kept to keep things like mice and rats at bay. And then you have big hunting dogs, which were owned for men. They look a lot more like greyhounds or whippets. She also has a bird in her hand as well, which the dog seems to be very curious about. And we often see children with birds on gravestones because we think the bird is also a symbol for the child's soul, that it's the part that flies away and leaves at the time of their passing. A lot of the things I have shown you, the toys, the little girl who's holding the bunny rabbit, all came from this one particular sanctuary dedicated to Artemis, who's the great protectress of children, particularly girls. She is also one of the goddesses responsible for childbirth. And it's really a beautiful site close by to Athens, and it's quite unusual because it is always green there, even in the summer when everything else is brown and dry in Greece. And it's because there's a natural spring on the site, so it's very well watered, and they found lots of interesting things that have been thrown into the spring. So we have wooden objects, things that never survive in other contexts, ivory objects that are preserved. We happen to know that there was a festival every year at the sanctuary called the Arctea. And this was a festival that centered around girls aged about 5 to 10. And it was a sort of a pre-puberty ritual. Now, we don't know what proportion of Athenian girls took place in these activities, but whenever I go there, I feel like I can hear the echoes of lots of squealing 7-year-olds all running around and having a grand old time without their parents, like a giant sleepover. But we do know that it seems to have been a very important event in the childhoods of young girls who were coming from elite families in particular. And typically children were participating in this, girls were participating in this just before they started menstruating. That seems to be the kind of general gist. And it was held only every 5 years, so it wasn't a regular occurrence. It was a very special thing to happen. And according to the myth associated with the site, there was a young girl, a young local girl, who teased a bear. And the bear in turn wounded her and drew blood, scratched her badly. And in revenge, her brothers killed the bear. And the goddess Artemis, who's the goddess of wild creatures, was very upset about this and needed to be appeased. And so that was the sort of founding legend for why this festival had to occur every 5 years, was to keep Artemis happy. And what the little girls would do is they would come and they would, quote unquote, play the bear. Like they would apparently run around like little wild animals. And there is this concept in ancient Greek thought, and of course this is the male perspective because that's what we have written down, is that girls and women were these sort of untamed creatures that you had to keep under control, usually through marriage. And you had to socialize them to do this. So girls were often compared to animals like bears, like horses, like deer. And we even still kind of use this terminology today in English. Like we might call a young woman like, oh, a filly. that still exists today, this sort of idea. So during this festival, there seems to have been an actual bear that was brought out at some point and may have been intended to scare the girls half to death, which may have sent them running around the sanctuary, running and screaming. And we had a number of vases that were found at the site that seemed to have been maybe used as part of the rituals, in which we see these little girls running. They wear short little dresses, which usually would have been far too immodest for them to normally wear, but this is what Artemis wears as a huntress. And I know it's hard to make out, but right over here, this is the bear right there, who seems to be on a leash. So the priestess must have brought the tame bear out on occasion. And we have these images of these little girls running, and apparently while they're running around, they rip their clothes off and then they just run around naked. This is part of the whole celebration. And the clothing that they wore was dyed yellow with saffron. And saffron was very commonly associated with women in antiquity and was used for a lot of female ailments, including cramps during your period. But it was also the same material that was used to dye the veils of brides, for example. So throughout a girl's life, she's often wearing saffron-colored garments, as sort of key transitions throughout her life. But I can only imagine the mayhem that must have ensued at this event. It must have been quite entertaining. And sometimes the little girls are shown actually running with their hands like little paws or claws, like they're pretending like they're actual little bears running around. As I mentioned earlier, girls, just before they got married, we'll talk more about this in just a moment, but girls were married very young by our standards today, usually between ages 13 and 15 years of age. So basically, as soon as they could carry a child, you married your daughter off. And they would dedicate their toys at this particular sanctuary. And we also know that women who died in childbirth, they often would dedicate the clothing of those women to the sanctuary as well, and they would be displayed quite prominently. We also have, I bounced back a couple slides, a lot of little statues like this of young boys and young girls, and we think these were dedicated by grateful parents for the safe delivery of their child, and that the child made it through those critical first years of life when mortality was so high. Here's another one of these vases. Here you can see the bear again quite clearly. Here's everyone taking off at a run, and the girls kind of holding their hands in funny little ways that might have shows with the play acting, and here they've gotten rid of their clothes at this point and they're running around. Now, one of the great, I should say, the education that young women received, girls and young women received when they were growing up, was essentially how to run a household. And one of the most important things they learned how to do was to produce textiles, and I mean from start to finish. So girls learned how to spin, how to dye with natural dyes, how to weave, how to embroider, and it was the most important skill that they brought with them to their new households when they got married, because all textiles were made in-house. All your clothing, all your bedding, every cushion cover, all was made by the women of the family. And in fact, before a young woman got married, she would actually make a tunic for her groom-to-be, and her in-laws would inspect it to see if it was up to snuff, because we're like, I'm not bringing a girl in here who can't, pull her weight here, or is going to make shoddy stuff for our household. So this was a really, really important facet of women's lives. And Textile production is well suited to women's lives because it's often work that can be interrupted very easily. So if you have a crying baby that you need to stop doing something and go tend to that baby, or maybe you need to go stir the stew that's bubbling on the hearth in the kitchen, you can easily do that. And the tools that you're using are safe to have around children. They aren't gonna cut themselves or hurt themselves. So you can have a baby crawling around at your feet while you are spinning or weaving or what have you. And I love this little vase. This is a little vase that was probably intended to hold olive oil. It's about yay high, teeny little thing. It's at the Met, and it's one of a pair, and we're gonna see the other vase in just a moment. But it shows all the different stages of textile production. So we have women weighing things, and what they're probably doing is they're weighing out wool for a project, just like if you're a knitter or crocheter, sometimes when you have a pattern, it won't tell you the length, it tells you the weight of the wool that you're using, and that's how much material you're going to need. And then we have women spinning. One woman is just sort of spinning by hand. She's just sort of twisting the fibers and she's making a thicker thread. Another woman is spinning with a spindle here and a distaff, and she's creating a much thinner, finer thread. And then you have the loom, and you have two women working at the loom, and they're passing a shuttle back and forth between the warp threads, and you can see the fabric that's already been woven has been rolled up at the top, so you can make quite a long piece of cloth. And most ancient Greek garments are simply giant rectangles that are pinned and sewn in different ways. So you can unpin them or pick all the stitches out, and it goes right back to being a rectangle again. One of the reasons why they did this, yeah, just like a sari, it has a lot of flexibility to it. You don't waste any material at all. Today, we usually are cutting pattern pieces out and you have a lot of scraps. This was so labor intensive, you didn't want to waste anything. And you probably continue to use a textile until it just disintegrated, essentially. One interpretation is that this might be the weaving of a very special garment. And there's actually quite a bit of detail put into how the loom is structured. And last semester when I taught a seminar on textiles, we actually used this vase to recreate a warp-weighted loom, like on this, and it actually worked like a charm. And so my students wove about 5 feet worth of fabric. It was quite impressive what they could do. But in Athens, where this vase comes from, most of this is Athenian material that I'm showing you today, there was a special gift that was given every year to the main goddess of the city, Athena. And Athena is the goddess of weaving. She teaches this technology to humankind. And every year on Athena's birthday, the city gives her a new garment for her statue to wear in her temple. And we call this kind of garment a peplos, the most standard, basic ancient Greek dress. And this peplos was made very ritually. It was very elaborate. It was woven like a tapestry. It showed a myth on it of the battle between the gods and the giants, and it was gold and purple, very fancy. But the creation of it began 9 months before the time of Athena's birthday, when she would receive this present. And again, probably 9 months is very intentional, the idea of like gestation, that this is how long it takes to make a person, this is how long it takes to make a garment. But we know that little girls were chosen from elite families in Athens. They're called the Araphoroi, and they were chosen to be the ones to string this loom. And they were probably like 7 to 10 years of age. And they would live the entire year on top of the Acropolis as servants to Athena. And we think that the building we're so familiar with today, the Parthenon, one interpretation of that name is it comes from Athena Parthenos, Athena the virgin, Athena the girl. However, Parthenos, or Parthenoi in the plural, just means young unmarried girls. And one thought is that the location of the Parthenon was previously the location of the house where these little girls would live on the Acropolis while they were serving Athena for their year of service. As they got older, as they were probably teenage girls, they also could be involved in the weaving of this very fancy textile, and it was intended to teach them these really essential life skills that they would need as they got older. Another thing that a young woman could do when she was a teenager is to serve as a kanephoros. And this is kind of the ancient equivalent of being a debutante, if you will, because you got to lead a sacrificial procession. You were the star of the show. You would carry a basket that would contain usually barley and the sacrificial knife that would be used to kill the animal that you were ritually offering. And you take the barley and you scatter it on the ground in front of the altar to try to lure the sheep, the goat, the cow, whatever, to willingly go to the altar. That was always a good sign that they went willingly to their death, if you will. And the kanephoros would wear her finest clothes. She would apparently powder her face with flour. She would wear her finest jewelry, essentially her bridal finery. She would wear necklaces of figs around her necks, apparently. And this was a way for these young women who had grown up very cloistered. These girls were never allowed to go out of their house unchaperoned, unescorted, for fear, gasp, they might talk to a boy. Oh, very dangerous. This leads to scary things. So as a father, you just clamped down on those girls and you didn't let them go anywhere or do anything. So this is her like big debut in society. And we know that the bachelors of Athens would come to these events and like check out who the kanephoros was, and they thought, oh, she looks pretty cute. Who's her father? And then they would go negotiate a marriage contract. So for young women to be chosen to do this was a big deal because it increased their odds of making a really good match, because people knew that they existed beyond their immediate family circle. And it was very common for families to intermarry with one another, that cousins would intermarry or uncles would marry nieces and things like that to keep the family, the money, the property, all together. So this is our kanephoros here, and she's wearing very fancy clothes, and she's carrying this rather odd looking basket on top of her head, and this is where all the sacrificial implements were kept. But only girls with the most immaculate reputations would be selected to do this sort of thing. And it would be a great slight if a girl was denied, if she had there were rumors flying around that she had maybe been talking to boys at the fountain house or things like that she should not have been up to. And we can recognize them quite easily because the kanephoroi, besides carrying their basket, wear a piece of cloth pinned on their shoulders like a Superman cape. And so that's the instant thing we know. And in fact, we have, again, grave markers with young women shown wearing this. And it's a clue to us that they died probably before they were married, and they're being shown in the greatest day of the life. The day that they were in the spotlight, everyone knew who they were, you're, praising her beauty, her virtue, all of these things, and that's how families would want their daughters to be remembered. Now, finally, the big day comes in your life. You've hit 13, here you go, your father's going to marry you off to some man who, anyone want to guess how old your average groom was? Around 30. So there was like, yes, like I said, there are things that were done in antiquity that we would think of as child abuse today. Yes, men were significantly older, and because women died much earlier, they often remarried multiple times because their wives would die in childbirth. So the wedding in ancient Greece was very different than what we think of as weddings today, because there's no vows, there's no like, do you, okay, you're married. There's no official priest that oversees any of this. Basically what happens is the groom comes to the bride's house, the bride unveils herself, supposedly willingly, but I'm sure there were plenty of parents who were like, with a knife in her back going, you don't do this and there's gonna be trouble. And then there was a procession from the bride's house to the groom's house. Everybody would have a nice feast, and the bride and groom would go into a bedroom and immediately consummate the marriage. Talk about a traumatic evening, right? And my favorite bit of all of this is like they recognize the trauma of it as the best man, who was shown here riding on the back of the wagon with the bride and groom. His job is to make sure no one kidnaps the bride. That's his number one responsibility. And he also guards the door to the bedroom. So if the bride is heard screaming and her parents come running, he's like, no one can come in. You have to get past me. And then all of her friends sit outside under the window and sing to her to console her that they're there with her in spirit. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about trauma here. We don't have lots of depictions of weddings that are shown in such great detail as this little vase, and this is the companion to the weaving vase. So they probably were commissioned at the same time and were probably intended as a wedding present. And typically when we have brides and grooms being shown in Greek art, they're shown, the bride and groom are standing in a chariot, and chariots were like the equivalent of very expensive and very temperamental sports cars today, right? And they weren't really practical to have in Greece, and horses were very expensive to raise, but it was meant to ennoble the bride and groom. Here, I love this depiction because they're riding in a donkey cart. This is probably much more likely of what the situation really was. So the bride and groom are riding in the first cart, and here we have the groom's house with a woman coming out, probably her, the mother of the groom. And the bride is seated with her veil kind of extended outward. And this is often referred to as the bridal gesture to indicate that unveiling, that she is willingly accepting her new husband. And she holds a wreath in her hand. And we know that both the husband and wife were given wreaths as part of the ceremony. And if you've ever been to an Orthodox wedding today, they still do this. The bride and groom are wreathed, they're tied together, and they walk around the altar 3 times, their first steps as husband and wife, and it comes from ancient Greece. If you notice, the mother of the groom, and this is probably the mother of the bride coming, they're carrying these things that look like strange forks in their hands. These are torches, and it's because weddings always took place at night. And the idea is that the mother of the groom is coming with fire from her hearth, and the mother of the bride is coming with fire from her hearth, and they're going to unite these two together. These two families are now going to be together as one. And the torches are meant to protect the bride and the groom from evil spirits and the evil eye and things like that at night. And in fact, in ancient Greece, if you did not go through the typical kind of ritual procession and the festivities for a wedding, you just had a common law marriage where you just moved in together. It was called a wedding without torches. That was the euphemism that they would use for it. Yes.
About 5 minutes?
Oh, yes, certainly. So now I'm going to talk about boys really quickly, how their lives split off. So where do you think these boys are up to? This is on the exterior, the 2 sides of a big wine cup. What do you think they might be? Music, absolutely. We've got some music being played on a double flute and lyres. Everyone thinks this is a laptop. Everyone's like, what is this? They had a Mac back in the day. No, not quite. This is a school scene. These are little boys at school. So only boys got a formal education. Girls did not, but you could hire private tutors. So what's happening here is he has these wooden tablets that are hinged like a book today. And on the inside, they would put a layer of wax, kind of like the old-fashioned like chalk and slate. And you would scratch into the wax your homework or what have you, and then someone could correct it. And when you didn't need that writing anymore, you just smooth out the wax and you can start over again. So it's like their notebooks. Yeah, this is just a sketching or doing your homework, what have you. Here's a reading lesson. So we have written on a papyrus scroll. I love the fact that this is absolute, somewhat gibberish of ancient Greek. It's meant to sound Homeric, but they use the wrong name of the wrong river, so it does not refer to the site of Troy. So you're like, oops, whoopsies here. Anyway, potters and vase painters were not the most literate of folks, let's just put it that way. So this is a classic kind of school scene, cup. The main subjects that boys would learn would be music, rhetoric, reading, and athletics. And athletics were a major part of your education because basically it was training you to fight on the battlefield. Because in ancient Greece, when you went into battle, you were wearing between 30 and 40 pounds of bronze armor. And you just had to be pretty strong to walk in that stuff, much less run or do anything else. So that's why athletics were basically peacetime training for war, that people would always be physically fit and be able to fight if needed. This is an unusual cup. This is the inside of the cup. So imagine this big broad bowl. This is in the interior. These are two girls who are walking, and one of them is holding one of those little notebooks that's folded up, and there's a little stylus that's been wrapped up. And so perhaps these girls are going to some kind of school. They are learning to read and write, but this is very, very, very unusual. I love that the one has the other one grabbed by the wrist, like she's kind of dragging her, like we are going, whether you like it or not. You're not playing hooky today. As I mentioned earlier, athletics, an incredibly important part of young men's adolescence, and they would work out in the gymnasium and would continue going to the gymnasium all throughout their adult lives. And they would participate in a wide variety of competitive athletics, everything from wrestling, boxing, races of different lengths, discus throwing, javelin throwing, all of our kind of classic Olympic sports. This is where it comes from. And then to kind of wrap things up, as a young man, as you were kind of ending your teenage years, this is when you would become a citizen. We know the most about Athenian citizenship because we have more written records. So when you were 18, you began your official mandatory military service. So you were like a reserve, essentially. And so you served for 3 years full-time. And you might be stationed in different fortresses around the area of Athens. But as you began this military service, you would swear an oath. This was known as the ephebic oath that you took when you were aged 18. And you would take this oath in front of this cave, so right around here. And this is just below the Acropolis Mount. And this is the shrine of Aglaros. And Aglaros was one of the 3 daughters of the first legendary king of Athens named Kekrops. And Aglaros was given a gift by Athena. It was a basket. And it's a bit like Pandora's box because she's told, don't open the basket. All 3 daughters are told, don't open the basket. And of course, they're going to open the basket. And what do they find inside? But a giant snake wrapped around a baby, which they all panic at, and they run, and they live on the Acropolis, and they run off the edge and they plunge their deaths. It's a very tragic story. So supposedly this is where Aglaros goes off the Acropolis and meets her end. So this is why the cave is named after her. But this seems to be very intentional because it's a reminder of that you are supposed to serve your duty. The orders that you are given, you must obey for the good of the state. Don't be like Aglaros, who did not follow instructions and bad things happened to her. Remember to be obedient. But one of the things I love about this oath is that you basically swore that you would never do anything to shame the city and that you would give your life to public service. And this is why democracy flourished in Athens the way that it did, because there was this mentality of your life is not your own. Your life is about serving the greater good, and whatever you are called upon to do, you will step up and do it. And maybe you're very wealthy and you're going to be called upon to make major financial donations to help build a temple or some other public spaces. Maybe you're going to be called up for military service, which you could be called up through age 45, and you would willingly go and serve the state. But this ephebic oath really resonated with people, and this idea that you would never, ever, ever do anything to shame the state of Athens. So with that note, I will leave you with the kind of end of a person's journey as a child in Greece by becoming a citizen, either by serving your duty in a public sense or serving your duty in a private sense. And that's what women did by raising their house, by raising their families, managing the households, so that men could serve in public service, that they could serve in public office. And starting at age 18, you were eligible to be elected for various public magistracies and things like that. And I love how they did elections in Athens, and maybe we should go back to this. On election day, every male citizen would come, a little bronze strip with his name on it, his father's name on it, and the tribe he belonged to, and you throw it in a big basket. And they go, okay, we are drawing for the chief judge of Athens. Bing! This is who it's gonna be for the next year. Very straightforward, very simple, very practical. But the idea was that you could trust all of your fellow citizens to do the right thing. And if they didn't and they screwed up, they're only in that position for a year. So how bad can it be? So with that, I will leave you. If you have any questions, I'm so happy to answer them. Thank you all for coming today, and it's been really a delight to chat with you all.
Keely has time to stay here for another 15-20 minutes. We have a 5:30 dinner reservation, so questions you can ask Keely now.
It can be totally
And otherwise-
related to this too.
You're free to leave, you know.
Yes, you can escape. Yes,
I may have missed it, but how old were the boys before? How old were the boys before they drank that 2.5 liters?
Usually 18.
18?
That's when you were a full citizen.
Did
Yeah.
any of them die from alcohol poisoning?
Well, they did mix it with water, so it was somewhat diluted, and from what we can tell, the alcohol percentages were lower than what we are typically used to in wine today. So it was more like 7-8% versus like 11-12%.
Beer.
Yeah, more like beer. But people drank often, and because it was safer than drinking the water. I mean, they didn't know what was in the water that made you sick, but they were like, well, I'm not dying early if I'm just drinking wine, so I guess this is a pretty good way to live. But yes, if you were a decent Greek, you never drank your wine straight, ever. You always mixed it with water. That was the civilized thing to do. You cut it, and apparently it must have tasted pretty gross because they mix in a lot of other things with it. They'll mix different vintages together. They'll mix herbs in, honey, for example. I think one of the maybe strangest things, but it does kind of make sense in a weird way, is we know that particularly in Italy, they like to grate cheese into it. So Parmesan cheese just went right in, and so you drink your wine, you have wine and cheese all in one. Very simple. Don't need a cracker at all for that. Very practical. But yeah, they had a pretty high tolerance for alcohol. We have a lot of vomiting scenes as well, though, so don't think they could always handle their liquor too well.
Now, the work was done by the slaves?
So certain roles, yes. So a lot of the really heavy lifting was probably done by enslaved peoples, and everyone could.
Well, the jeweler, the person who made the jewelry, let's say.
That would probably be someone who was a free citizen. So you have your slaves do like the donkey work kind of thing. They're your people who are doing heavy labor out in the fields. They're your miners. They're doing all the jobs that nobody really wants to do. And pretty much every household could afford to have enslaved persons. However, what's kind of different, we think of slavery in the sense of Africans who were brought to this country and they're of a different race, and that's how you could identify someone as a slave pretty quickly because they looked different from you. It's not the case in classical antiquity. People would, this sounds terrible, but it's true, people would sell their own children into slavery. I mean, it sounds horrible, but if you could not afford, if you were about to go into bankruptcy, that was a way to raise some money. Or it was a way of holding a stick over your daughter's head, like, you know, you have premarital sex, I will sell you. I don't know about you, but that would make me behave. I'd be like, all right, Dad, I will not talk to the cute boy down the street. Thank you very much. I will obey whatever you want me to do. So honestly, you probably couldn't tell who was free or enslaved except by the quality of the clothing that they were wearing. Sometimes slaves were branded or tattooed as well. And enslaved women often had their hair cropped short. So, for example, like within the household, because decent ladies weren't supposed to go out alone by themselves, they would not go fetch water from the public fountain houses, but instead they would send their household slaves to do it, because it was fine for those women to go. But if you want to maintain your pristine reputation, you would not go yourself as like the mistress of the household type of thing. But yes, they were very, very common. Everyone had people that they owned. And that's frankly how their economy worked, because they had so much cheap labor. That's how they could build all this stuff and do all these things, because it was affordable. I saw lots of other questions. Yes,
On the cup that showed the boys in school,
Yes.
there was a gentleman to the right side of each where he's seated, sort of looking on from the side, and he has a shepherd's crook.
Uh-huh.
And there's one in each section. Are those, is that the teacher?
No, that is the manny. That is the pedagogos. So if you were a well-to-do Athenian family, you had a man watch your male children to make sure they went to school and came back home and did not get up to any shenanigans along the way.
With
So
the big stick?
with the stick, yeah. Imagine what they did with the stick, right? Very effective disciplinary tool.
Thank
But
you.
yes, that's what they're there. They're waiting for their pupils to finish their lessons, and then they'll bring them home. Yes.
Now, there were really two cities in Greece. You had Athens and you had Spartacus. Or Sparta, I should
Uh-huh,
say.
yes.
This, I assume, is all Athenian.
This is all Athenian. So the Spartans are very different. I didn't have enough time to get into it too much. The Spartans had a very harsh system of raising their boys called the agoge. And you basically push them to the brink. It was like crazy boot camp, essentially. So they intentionally would not feed the boys enough to encourage them to steal but not get caught. And they were training them for war. The idea is that you're in enemy territory, you have to learn how to steal food without getting caught. Or you have to toughen yourself up to the elements, so you don't get a blanket to sleep under in the winter time. You only get one garment to wear every year. You don't get shoes to wear, for example. And the idea was if you couldn't hack it, you died. And they didn't want you to survive because they didn't want you to have children. So it was very intentional breeding in Sparta. Now, what is more humane in Sparta than what happened in Athens is that Spartan women did not get married until they were older. They didn't get married until they were 18. And it's because the Spartans realized that if women were older when they married and started having children, they had healthier babies, they survived pregnancy better, and the idea was to bring lots of healthy boys into the world. That was the goal of the Spartans. And the Spartans had an interesting economic system. They enslaved their neighbors. Nice guys, right? And the neighbors were called the helots, and the helots did all of the daily work, everything like the blacksmithing and the raising the crops and, herding the sheep or whatever it may be. And what Spartan men did was they just trained for war. That's all they did. They lived in military barracks. And that's why they were the most formidable soldiers in the ancient world. And the story is that they would carry these shields with this like kind of upside down V, and it was the L, the lambda, for Lacedaemonians, which is what they call themselves. And when people saw those shields coming, they just turned tail and ran because they knew they were going to be massacred. Because the Spartans were really the only professional standing army in ancient Greece, and were trained within an inch of their lives, and had a mentality of, you don't go home a loser. You either die in the battlefield or you win. Those are the only options. And so Spartan mothers famously would tell their sons, you come back with your shield, i.e. victorious, or on your shield that you died on the battlefield. Spartan women are very pithy. They're also apparently very beautiful in antiquity. That's why Helen of Troy is a Spartan. That's where she comes from. Spartan girls and women, like I said, got married later in life. Curiously enough, on their wedding night, they would shave their heads and they would dress like a boy. Run with this in your imaginations, okay? This was to make them more attractive to their spouses.
Oh, that's weird.
Also, too, this is another kind of cringeworthy fact of life in Sparta. The way a man wooed a woman, or basically forced her to marry him, is that he would physically subdue her. He'd basically come up behind her and wrestle her down to the ground. And the thought was that if he wasn't strong enough to do that, we don't want him getting married and having children, because there's going to be wimpy babies, and we don't want wimpy babies in Sparta. Thank you very much. So it's this crazy, genetic planning that they are doing that is really brutal and harsh. But for women, women's lives were so much better in Sparta than they were in Athens. So if I were to go back in time as a woman, I would totally opt to go to Sparta, because women had a lot of freedom. They ran their own households. They did their own thing. It's like, honey, yeah, go play with your buddies. Go play war. Yeah, whatever. I'm going to rule the house the way I want. I'm going to do everything the way I want to do it in my house. I rule the roost. I'm supreme. Thank you very much. And women in Sparta were renowned for being having very strong characters, very strong personalities, beautiful, smart, funny, lots of wisecracks come from Spartan women. But Athenian ladies too have their sassy moments as well. If you would like to read a very raunchy play, read Lysistrata. Everyone's like, oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In the original Greek, it is so much better and so much worse when it comes to the X-rated level of the language. Everything's like double entendre. But if you're not familiar with this play, this is a story about an actual war that took place between Sparta and Athens. And it was kind of like Sparta and Athens had a bit sort of like a Cold War for a long time. And then it came to loggerheads and it was catastrophic for Athens. And the war went on for 30 years. And in the play, the women of Athens have had enough of this nonsense. They're tired of their husbands and their brothers and their fathers dying for what they see as a totally purposeless conflict. And so they decide to have a sex strike. Even the prostitutes are in on it. And all the women go up to the Acropolis and they barricade themselves up there and they're like, no one's getting any. And the play is about these men begging, please come down. And the women kind of doing little stripteases and what have you, and they're like, you're killing me, don't do this. Anyway, it's a very, very funny play. But it does show there's a definite kind of recognition of a bit of battle of the sexes in ancient Athens as well.
You got to admit, there's no better note to end it.
I know. If you want some spicy reading for later, you can check that out.
Keely, thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for listening.
The next talk in the Invited Speaker Series will be in about a month. That will be Michael Zweig, who is an emeritus professor of economics, talking about poverty comes for the working class. That will be February 24th. Thank you all for coming.